some games that have been pretty heavily analyzed so far, and I think my analysis is going to be pretty unsophisticated relative to high-level GMs. But anyways, I was still going to do an analysis here and basically take a look at some of the games, some of the openings from the World Championship games between Carlsen and Caruana. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at these before. They've been on my list for a long time, so I just kind of wanted to look at them, kind of figure out, what strengths were, what possibly could have been played here, and kind of get a sense for the opening theory. I think it's pretty safe to say that anything played in the openings here is going to be is going to be pretty sound and safe material, given this was a world championship match. So I wanted to kind of use it not to really focus on the whole games. The whole games, by the way, are interesting, although 12 draws. But the thing that I was curious about was just basically looking at the opening theory here. Where did they deviate? What the normal themes are? How things are different. Yeah, we can take a look at those. So basically here, this one's out of the Nimzovich Rosalimo attack. This is a pretty common opening for White. One where White trades for the. Hey, thank you very much for the follow. Hi, thank you very much for joining the stream. So basically here, we're kind of in a situation where, we're looking at popular openings, and trying to understand kind of what world championship level play is out of those openings. If you're playing a high level opening, you might as well take a look at, the world championship matches, for inspiration here. And basically here, this will go into main line for quite a while. It's unusual to see novelties at the highest level. So I think that this is just going to take us through, very high level theory out of this line for quite some time. So let's take a look. Basically, this knight to d7 move, there's a split here between castles here and knight to d7. It's up to basically, it's basically up to black to choose what to play. Moving the same piece twice in the opening feels awkward, but in this particular line, I think bringing the knight over to b6 is the general theme, right? So knight to d7, this temporarily blocks this bishop, but it basically opens up the fianchetto for this bishop. Bishop to e3, e5, castles, b6. And again, we're still, from what I can tell, basically in pretty popular theory. Here's where the split was, from the main line to the not main line. e5 is played, then castles is the second most popular move here. If we're looking at the analysis, I think castles is probably going to get evaled as the best move. But basically, castles versus queen to d2 are the two options here. Castles is about a 16% move, something like that. Castles, queen to e7, queen to d2. And basically here, knight to f8 is played. This idea is, this is a pretty interesting idea. Basically black is looking for opportunities and ways to advance. These knight moves feel fairly inefficient for black, but, they're played with the idea of a, pretty solid positional advance later. Hey, welcome, Alexandre. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So knight to f8 is played here as black. Then bishop to h6. Here's that bishop to h6 that people talk about. Obviously it's playable in these types of Sicilian lines. Hey, I'm not tired at all. I'm awake. Hey, thank you very much for joining the stream, Aphelion. Thanks. I'm feeling good, man. But yeah, this early bishop to h6. Facing off against g7. Ideas like f6, bishop takes g7, queen takes g7, knight to e2, knight to e6. You look tired, Alexandre. Knight to e6, knight to h2, g5, and basically White's going to be able to, play here, move his pawns to, or move his knight to f5, and I think it should be good. Nah, I'm just chilling. Chilling here with Jen on the nice Thursday night or Friday night, sorry. This is cool. Starting the weekend off with some chess, always helpful. Knight to g3, knight to g4, knight to f4, knight to e2, and basically, this White's making the idea to play against the king. Bishop to e6, knight takes f4, g takes e4, and basically here, White has kind of established a fairly, mediocre position. Carlsen is so efficient about how he does this. Let's look at b6. This was a sideline. b6, knight to h2, knight to f8, f4, bishop takes, rook takes. And white's doing fine here. Rook takes f4, things are cool. F6 is probably pretty good for, f6 looks like it's good for black here, blocking off this file. Bishop to e6, main line. Rook to f2, h6, queen to d2. And basically, white's looking fine here. Black is better. Black can play moves like g5, h5, g4. But yeah, g5. I don't know. Rook af1 could be good potentially. But basically here, white has kind of regained his advantage. So let's look at this again. e4, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. White is looking fine. This is the Rossolimo attack. Bishop takes. Here's the main split. D takes versus B takes. Up to black what to do. Carlsen opts for D takes C6. I think generally this is considered to be more passive. I think B takes C6, is considered to be a more dynamic option for black. But let's go with D takes C6 in this game. And yeah, this is game one of the 2018 match. I actually haven't gone through these before. Hey, good luck, Kiro. Thanks for joining the stream. Good luck, Kiro. I hope you do well. And if you have any good games, please send them our way. I'm very curious to see. That's cool. Where is the tournament? So yeah. So basically, this h3 plays up against. Yeah, no, this one goes about 108 moves. I wanted to focus more on just learning the Rossolimo attack. There's some specific theory in this game. This knight to f6, knight to d7, knight to f8 theory, where black basically gets a pretty solid position. Let's look at where the eval really shifts here. F4, rook takes, bishop to e6. So far, everything's fine. These are many best moves played by grandmasters. And the real error, I think, for white, I think that this is a little bit slow. Again, these guys are so much stronger than everybody, but anyways, I'm just, they're not stronger than the engine, so I'm just sort of looking at the engine line. Knight to g4, I think, is considered to be inefficient here. In the opening book, knight to g4 is a common line, and a4 is a common line. The engine seems to have preference for a4. Yeah, these guys are machines. It's pretty impressive. So yeah, a4, a5 versus knight to g4, knight to f6. This looks better for white. So say knight to g4, castles, knight to f6, knight to d7, and then knight to h5 here. I think knight to h5 is an error. I think this idea in general seems to be getting pretty ungenerous treatment from the well, good luck, Kira. I'm really rooting for you, and would love to see games from that tournament if you have any interest in sending them. So yeah, so basically, this knight to g4, knight to f6. I think that this thought is probably, this thought, while being explored in in opening theory, having been played before in high level games. I think this is not what the engine proposes, and I think that it might not be the strongest attack for white. After black neutralizes this, so knight to f6, knight to d7, I think black gets a pretty good position with his bishop and queen facing towards the king side. And yeah, we were taking welcome, Smiggy. I know it's late your time, but we're looking at GM games. I was gonna take a look at some games from Carlsen versus Caruana in 2018. I guess I was kind of curious. I haven't looked at these over. It was the type of thing where I had a lot of at the time I was pretty busy, and it's nice to actually have a few minutes to look these over. Years later, but. f6, b3, bishop to f7, knight to d1. Okay, so this is pretty interesting. I would figure this is good for black, with black playing bishop takes h5 here. Okay, knight to f8, knight takes f6. I guess at some level I'm sort of it's hard to even look for improvements in games that are this strong, but I'm just kind of looking at the eval. So basically what happened in this game. This was a Rossolimo attack, and what was unusual about this, yeah, the rerouting of the white knight was cool. The white knight basically goes to basically h5, takes the pawn, goes back to h5, and then doubles the pawns on the rook file. But I think we can go through the game. I guess it's 100 moves long. I don't really want to spend that much time on it, I guess. But what I'm saying mostly about this opening is what happened thematically here, and is this attack that we can draw from the is this an attack that we can draw from to our games? And in this Rossalimo attack, so as a Sicilian player, what's unusual about this game is that basically black starts an aggressive attack on the king side here. White sort of opens it up. Basically, white is the first to strike on the king side, but what ends up happening on the white side is, basically white is attacking, but black expands on the king side as well. So the queen side's actually getting neglected here. In this line, which is an established opening line, white generally plays a4 as opposed to a4 as opposed to knight to g4. But anyways, knight to g4, castles, knight to f6, rook, knight to d7, knight to h5. But all the play for both sides is on the king side. It's not as if black is pushing on the queen side here, which is something that you might think would be possible in this type of game. But yeah, let's take a look. The knight, the one that went to d1. Yeah, so I mean, again, this is very high level stuff. So knight to c3, knight to d1. Let's check that out. Yeah, knight to d1, and then this knight gets rerouted to... I actually haven't seen this game before, Aphelion, so it's cool to get to take a look at this. Okay, so knight, rook, queen. And I think black is basically better. I think that this queen side is pretty compromised. Queen to e6, and then basically this, this rook to g8 move. Knight to f2, rook to g8, knight to g4. Basically, all this play for both sides on the king side here. I don't think black can really force the issue much, but let's see sort of what happens. Threats on h5, sure. But I don't think that basically, white ends up with that much of an opportunity here. Bishop to c7, king to e2, and yeah, by this point, black's gotten full penetration into the king side here. I don't know how Caruana manages to draw this, to be completely honest. Are flank pawns worth less than regular pawns? Yes, definitely. Hey, welcome, Haig. For tonight's review, here's the Discord. Definitely join the Discord, Haig. Here you go. The link to the Discord is here. It usually takes a few. I usually don't do unless we get an open slot or someone cancels or something. We usually take a few days to get the games into the stream. At this point, the games, there are many games, so it takes a while to get them onto the stream. But if you have any ideas for lessons, those will get onto the stream much more soon. So if you're interested in any particular material, there's many more open slots if you want to take a look at like instructional material as opposed to a game. But feel free, send a game into the game submission section on Hagen. But it's gonna be a couple days at least. Yeah, thanks for the idea, Hagen. Please send game on the Discord. Cool. Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Thank you very much for sending that, Hagen, and we'll get it in as soon as possible. But yeah, if you have any ideas too for lesson ideas, that's its own channel, and I promise those will be on the stream a little bit sooner than the game will. But thanks for joining us for sure, Hagen. I really appreciate it. So basically, I'm surprised that Caruana manages to draw this, to be completely honest. Looks like this bishop's supporting this pawn here. And I want to take a look at Smiggy's point here, which is that are flank pawns worth less than regular pawns? The answer is definitely yes. So if you were to assess these two pawns, from a computer perspective, these two pawns together probably are worth something along the lines of 1.2 pawns. It's very limited advantage to the second rook pawn. Doubled isolated rook pawns, basically doubled isolated rook pawns are worth 1.2 to 1.5 pawns. They're basically not worth the same as the pawns were before. In fact, if you get the opportunity to create doubled rook pawns for your opponent, that can often be an underestimated opportunity, because basically the point of coming up with a situation like this This doubled isolated rook pawns. Basically, you end up in a situation where you end up in a situation where black has basically lost the value of his pawns. So like if you think about flank pawns, right? The pawn on the G file and the pawn on the H file together are probably worth 1.8 or 1.9 pawns. It's basically worth almost 2 pawns if the pawns are undoubled. Like they act basically normally as pawns, and they may have less relevance to the center, less relevance to other pieces in the board. But if you can double those pawns, it's almost the same as winning one of them, right? Like if you could change the eval from one point of those pawns of that pawn structure from 1.9 pawns to 1.2 pawns, that's a win of 7/10 of a pawn. So basically, this is again like a pretty difficult way to it's not the most intuitive way to think about it, but it's the way that the computer evaluates these types of things, and I think that that's valuable. So if you can double and isolate your opponent with rook pawns, that's almost a win of a pawn for you, even if you don't actually win the pawn. Just because the second, basically the second doubled pawn is adding very little value in addition to the first pawn. On the other side, if you have a way to undouble your pawns, that's usually worth it because, you're basically getting a pawn back into the game that you didn't have previously. So yeah, the answer is yes, Miggy. You make a really good point. Basically, pawns are not all at equal, are not all at equal strength. This doubled isolated rook pawn worth barely more than 1 pawn. Same with doubled isolated pawns in general. The point of the pieces relative to each other is that they don't really have consistent values. Basically this this pawn in this case is worth 1.3 pawns, and this pawn in this other case is worth 0.7 pawns. Like it's really a question of more how well they can convert, and these values are situational. In fact, like it's kind of weird the concept of having pawns not worth 1. The computer doesn't value each pawn equally. They use 1 as kind of a reference unit, but there's so much situationally, there's so much situationally like dependent concepts here that yeah, it depends on the circumstances. What about those C pawns? This is a case where you have 2 characteristics. So basically, these C pawns are not worth as much as regular pawns, except for the fact that they control center squares. So you basically have two countering evaluations here. You have basically a doubled pawn, which in isolation is weaker, and then you have a pawn, controlling center squares, which in isolation is stronger. So that's kind of the opposite there, and what I'm thinking of. And basically, it is situationally dependent at the end of the day. Yes, exactly. There's a really cool line. I think there was a line in Rapid Chess Improvement, but and I think it was Rapid Chess Improvement. It was definitely some book with a good integrated computer analysis where they were talking about basically, how much is a pawn on the 7th worth? It's worth much more than a pawn on the 2nd rank or the 3rd rank or whatever. And the reason why is because in order to equalize it, so basically in order to take it off the board, odds are you're probably going to have to sacrifice a piece. So like, if you basically have to sacrifice a piece to get rid of a pawn on the 7th, then that pawn on the 7th is worth roughly a piece, right? Because that's what it would take to neutralize it. So evals are really interesting. Computer analysis is really interesting. I'm actually taking a machine learning course at the moment, and hoping to take another AI course relatively soon. But yeah, overall, computer analysis is super, super interesting. Like, there's really cool evaluations. Many are very situationally dependent, and yeah, just cool way that things are kind of advancing in this sphere. Yeah. I think you could. There are some really interesting chess engines too. I mean, I don't know. To be honest, I think you need I don't think you can beat I don't think you can improve on AlphaZero without millions and millions of dollars. But just the concepts here are really interesting, and really helpful sometimes because you can think of like what's objectively the best. I'd go with the Tedfish. Yeah, I think the Tedfish 1.0. That's about right. I think my engine would play at about a 1200 level, but in any case, basically this idea, this way of assessing pawns from an objective value is, I think, an advancement in the in the way that we look at chess. So, anyways, if you have the opportunity to create doubled isolated pawns on the rook file, that can often be helpful, and that's usually a good idea. Basically because of the way that it and is kind of objectively evaluated to be a good idea based on the way that the engine barely adds any value for your second isolated rook pawn. Anyways, Tedfish 1200. I'll take it. Assuming that I can bake an engine or something at all, I would be happy. So, anyways, ideas here. Basically, black gets great penetration into white's territory. I'm sure Caruana is going to come up with awesome ideas to basically tactically hold on to these pawns. But yeah. Yeah, so basically when both of the two pawns are on the A or H file, yeah, that's exactly right, Amet. Basically, if the if the pawns are isolated on the rook file, then basically that's barely worth more than one pawn. If you have one pawn on H4, so like if we were to just think of a situation, if we were just to think of a situation here where basically we have a pawn on H3 and a pawn on H4. That's barely worth more than if there was just a pawn on H4. Maybe a little, but not very much. Since we're talking about this, yeah, that's right. No, that's right. I mean, any basically doubled pawns on the rook file on the endgame can't win. So actually, I think this might be a really good opportunity since we know this game is a draw. Let's think a little bit about this from a conceptual perspective. Because I really think this topic of evaluation is really interesting. Let's see if we can edit this game. I want to take this game and basically start adjusting the position. Let's see if we can get that to happen. I'm sort of curious this is sort of a tricky thing from the eval. Yeah, no, definitely not good to have pawns on the A or H files. But what I'm thinking is, like, can we take this and put it back into analysis mode once we've edited it? Because what I want to do is I want to just add a pawn to the board and show what it's worth, basically. I think this will be really interesting. So let's actually do something that's kind of this might be kind of unusual, but I think it will help illustrate this topic really well. Let's take the board here, okay, and look at the eval. So if we take the starting position, right, so let's do e4, e5, and then run the report here. So here, basically on e4, e5 with white to move, you have an advantage of 0.43, right, as white. So this is this isn't surprising. This is about what white's initiative is, yeah, well, no, I mean, I think that's what it is. So what I want to take a look at here, Smiggy, is basically I want to take a look at the relative values of pawns on an analysis board. So we're going to do e4, e5, and then we're going to take a look at the evals of this situation. So we have e4, e5, and then I want to go to the setup section. Let's try this again. Okay, so I want to move this here, move this here, move this here, and look at the eval. So if we have this, we basically have this custom position, right? We've created this, oh, it might not let me do it because it's not technically a legal position. That's so annoying. All right, let me try this again. We'll do it with the Scandinavian opening then. So e4, d5, pawn takes, queen takes, and then run the report here. And we have an eval advantage of 0.5 for white. Yeah, I think that's right. I think I can't have 9 pawns. Let me try this again, though, because I'm trying to do something sort of interesting here. Or at least I think it's interesting. So pawn takes, pawn takes, queen to d5. And then I want to... man. All right, let me try that again. Okay, so we'll take this one off the board. And take this one off the board, put the queen here, and put the pawn here. So let's load this and take a look at the oh, it's really, they make you make a move. Okay, so say knight to c3 here. Here, let's do the eval. The eval here is plus 2.03 for white. The eval here is 0.74 for white, right? So let's look at the eval. So we basically created an illegal position, but that's okay. This white eval is plus 0.9. This eval is plus 2.17. Okay, so let's take those two for comparison. Then let's basically put another pawn on the board. So if we have this position, it's 2.17. So let's open up another one and say in this situation what the eval is. So here, set up here with a pawn on f4, for example. This is another position. I don't think this is going to be legal, but basically here with knight to c3, the eval is going to be. I think the eval is going to be bigger than 2.17. Yeah, so the eval here is 2.44. So we have 2.16 for the rook pawn and 2.44 for the f pawn. So basically, look, the material is not, basically the material here is not different. This has 8 pawns for white, and this has 8 pawns for white. And there's not really all that much going on the board, tactically speaking or positionally speaking, in either case. But the engine evaluates this addition of a pawn for basically 2.16, and this addition of a pawn for 2.44. So what I'm saying is, it's a pawn in either case, right? And it's a doubled pawn in either case. But the fact of the matter is, like, if this pawn is double on the f file, that's way stronger than having a doubled pawn on the a file. Rook pawns in particular are much weaker, but you can take positions like this and kind of see, like, how much is it really worth to have that extra, pawn. Here, what's interesting about it is, the extra pawn in either case is worth a lot. Adding a pawn anywhere on the board is worth 1.7 pawns here, so that's interesting too. Basically this differing value of the extra pawn on the board, is really interesting. It's just, I would figure that that adding a rook pawn would be worth less than a pawn, but actually it's worth 1.7. Whereas adding the one to the f file, adds 2 pawns to the board. So that is pretty interesting. I don't know how practically useful this is specifically, but I'm thinking along the lines of, is it useful? Is it basically the pawns are worth different values on different files. If you put one at f4, it's worth a very different amount than if you put one on a3. So overall, I think that's interesting. Yeah, so I think I think that probably none of the pawns are going to be isolated there. So yeah, but what I'm saying, yeah, no, I think that's right. But I think it's worth it basically just in terms of, yeah, so if the pawns are isolated, right, you're making a very good point. So we can keep playing around with this analysis if people are interested. But basically here, let's set up this position and take, basically take this. So let's look at we're going to look at 2 different positions here. This is the first. And here we have this isolated pawn on the f file. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good idea. I like that. Basically, yes. Let's try that. Let's try that out. Let's try king and rook. Let's try king rook endgames or something like that. Something that's pretty simple. My guess is that the value of a doubled pawn in a king and rook endgame is going to be very low. So let's take a look. Let's basically start off with this situation where you have 2 pawns here and 2 pawns here, and a rook. Say rook here, king here. All right, so we're in this situation. This is about equal. It's probably going to be very close to equal in terms of eval, is my guess. If we run a if we run an eval here, it's going to be pretty close to equal. So the engine sees equality in this game. Let's try again with a different situation. If we have a king and rook pawn endgame where one of the sides has doubled pawns and one of the sides has undoubled pawns, I'm guessing that's probably not going to be about equal. So say here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here. And yeah, in this situation, so let's say, this one's exactly the same except for the pawns are like this. In this case, we're going to have pawns that are worth way less than 2 pawns for black. The engine probably takes it to a drawing situation anyways, but here what I also think is kind of interesting is we could make this even more extreme. So here basically the engine basically takes this completely to a draw, and but I think what's going to be really interesting is if we add a third pawn here. So I think we can create a situation in which the additional pawn has no value at all. In this case, with the king here and 3 pawns, this is also going to be a draw. It's also going to be basically the king is going to be worth. Yeah, it probably is. But what I think is kind of interesting here is basically we have we've had 3 different positions. If we have the pawns on b5 and b6, this is going to be a draw on g7. This tripled pawn doesn't really add anything to the position either. I guess the endgames probably are too simple. Basically this is a demonstration of when a pawn is worth 0 extra. But yeah, so yes, so the rook and pawn endgames make it much more likely to be a draw. All right, I like your idea. Let's try it as a king and pawn endgame. Yeah, but anyways, that demonstrated a situation in which an additional pawn had no value. If you have a situation where there's rook pawns, then there's no value in in having an extra rook pawn, or very little value in having an extra rook pawn. So if you can turn your opponent's g and h pawns into doubled h pawns, it's almost the same as winning an h pawn, or it's almost the same as winning a pawn, or winning the g pawn there. Since there's not much additional value for having the second rook pawn. That's really what I'm trying to get at in the broader picture of this. So yeah, we can try this. Say in this situation, the eval here for white is these are all going to be drawn. All right, I think it might be better to do it in a middle game position, to be completely honest. Anyways, my point is, Smiggy asked a very good question about rook pawns, and the idea is if you can turn pawns on the G file and the H file that are worth about 2 pawns together. No, I did too. I mean, that endgames I think are not the way to demonstrate that the best. But yeah, thank you very much no, thanks a lot. I just can't make an endgame not drawish if it's that simple. But yeah, what I'm thinking is basically here. This idea. So basically, this idea of turning the G pawn and H pawn into doubled H pawns is almost the same as winning the G pawn, because the value of the pawns on the G file and H file is almost 2, but the value of doubled pawns on the H file is almost 1. That's what I'm saying. So it's practically a win. Practically a win for a pawn if you can double and isolate rook pawns. Anyways, it's interesting. So rook to f2, h6, queen to d2, and basically white's looking fine. I don't really think there's any, I think that white's playing this position. You're also interested in looking at the relative values of b6 for bishop takes c6, whether d6 or b6 is better. Honestly, I think they're about the same. Engine is suggesting b takes c6, but Carlson plays d takes c6. I think d takes c6 is probably more conservative. B takes c6 and you improve the mobility of your rook, your rook on the b file and your bishop on the a6 to f1 diagonal. But yeah, that's a key part of this game. Since we sort of got sidetracked on that demonstration of relative pawn values, let's go on to game 2 from this. Overall, we learned an interesting thing from this idea. This game shows a very interesting and instructive way to play basically the entire Sicilian on the king side for both sides. That's somewhat unusual. I usually think of the Sicilian as being asymmetric in terms of where the pawns are. But yeah, knight f3, knight f6, d4, d5. Okay, cool. So this is Queen's Gambit declined with an early e6. Yes, so b6. You're right. B takes c6. That tends to be that's basically better for b takes c6 is better for black because it turns it into a Sicilian type position. c6, knight to c3, bishop to e7. Okay, white's up about half a pawn here, something like that. Let's keep going. Bishop to f4, castles, e3, and I think white's pretty comfortable. White's up about half a pawn here or so. It's sort of, it's basically a pretty standard Queen's Gambit declined game. c5 is what Carlsen plays here. We've looked at this exact position multiple times before. This is a position that comes up in a lot of people's games. Basically, knight to f3 and kind of this. I didn't know it's called a Harwitz attack. Honestly, like it's so helpful. I get to learn so many names of openings going through these theories. Harwitz attack, cool. So this knight to c3, knight to f3, bishop to f4 against an e6 structure with c6 the c pawn not having moved yet. This happens in a lot of games, and we have a lot of options here. So there's c5, knight b7, b6, c6. c6 is probably the most passive. I'm guessing that c6 is probably going to get evaluated as not very good. I don't know. It seems to lead to being a little bit worse. c6 is what I would actually be inclined to play. Maybe I'm playing these situations too passively when I think about it. But c6 basically is a position that turns this into a semi-Slav structure and one in which black is just very solid in the middle. Passive, but solid. I think in this type of situation, you would play knight to c6 or knight to d7, probably pawn takes c4 and knight to b6. I don't think you would do a break with black's pawns. Maybe you'd play pawn takes c4, bishop takes c4, c5. Potentially that could be a way to open up this situation. But I'm just sort of reflecting on my own situation here. c6 is what I would be inclined to play here, and c6 is not the most aggressive option. What was played here instead was c5. c5 challenges white in the center. I think that's good. Basically, this e3 and c5, that ends up being a pretty good. I think that ends up being a pretty good situation for white. So d takes c5, b takes c5, and overall here, I think white's up by a little bit. I don't know, c takes d5 potentially, but overall black is fine here. Options could be knight to c6, but we're in mainline. We're in basically mainline Queen's Gambit theory, and I think things are fine. So overall, pushing on c5 was not overly aggressive. D takes c5 is by far the most common option for black, and I think common option for white, and I think black gets a good position out of this. So this is making me sort of reevaluate how I would play this position, and makes me sort of more likely to play c5 in the future. With the king already castled so early, there's not really that much risk in playing c5, actually. If you play c5, pawn takes c5, b takes c5, things are fine. No real issues there. Sort of, I guess I would say, if this c pawn trades off for the d pawn, white has traded his centralized pawn on the 4th rank for black's non-centralized pawn on the 7th rank. So overall, c5 pressing this issue sooner makes a lot of sense. It probably is objectively the best way to play. So I should think more about playing c5 in these types of positions. Anyways, I guess this is sort of just making me kind of reassess where I should set my dial on this. Knight bd7 is more passive, but it is a developing move. b6 is interesting. b6 is, quickly trying to develop that bishop to b7. Interesting. But c5 is the most common and best move here. I would have played c6, but I would have been wrong, basically. D takes c5, b takes c5. Options for white include queen to c2, a3. So bishop takes c5, a3. C takes d5 potentially. On c takes d5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, and then e takes d5. This isolated queen's pawn position for black, this is fine as well. This is going to offer this isolated queen's pawn could become kind of a liability. But with knight to c6, bishop to g4, you're probably going to have an opportunity to simplify it with d4. Isolated queen's pawns are a pretty distinct pawn structure. They involve usually having very good bishops in a relatively open position. That's something to consider in in an isolated queen's pawn position. But all of these options, were considered in this game, I'm sure. But c5 provides an early challenge to white's center, and watching a world champion do this makes me think that makes me place more weight on it in my own games. B takes c5, queen to c2, knight to c6. We're still very in kind of very early theory here. A3 and rook to d1 are possible. Those are the two main line moves. A3 threatens to expand quickly on the queen side with b4. That's going to provide a pretty solid attack, I think, for white. White doesn't have his d pawn anymore, and he's uncastled. But realistically, grandmasters play. I guess what I would say is I think examining my own biases is always kind of a helpful approach. And basically, I would say, well, why are you playing on the queen side, and why are you expanding on the queen side? Like, this position is going to end up basically, this king is not castled. The king safety for white's king is somewhat weak here. Why are you, basically expanding on the queen side? Isn't that going to cause problems? And I think the answer is not really. Like, at this level, they have the tactics calculated out so well. Black can try to exert pressure here, but the king safety is never really that much at risk. White can calculate out rook to d1 and potentially queen to d2, but I guess when I sort of look at this position, I sort of start seeing phantom threats, right? They don't really exist. This looks like a diagonal that's dangerous for black, but not really, because there's not the tactical follow-up needed to to open this up. Knight to d4 looks dangerous, but there's always there's always sort of comfortable responses for white here. I guess what this really kind of points to is that you have a need for larger tactical vision, and really to calculate things out as opposed to just doing it by feel. Here, I think that a5 is kind of white can't push b4 because pawn takes and then queen takes rook, but queen to a5 is not done because it really threatens e1. It's done because, hey, welcome Thorsta, thank you very much for joining the stream. So basically here, queen to a5 faces off against e1, but there's nothing really that frightening there. There's no way to kind of advance this. With rook to d1, knight to d4, and I think is b4 playable here? I think knight takes d4. I guess here c takes d5. I guess it's not really a direct threat either. There's not enough resources on that. So, anyways, interesting situation. Let's just keep going through the game. Again, I'm not going to be able to make many improvements on this World Championship game, but at the same time, I think it does illustrate some really important principles. Bishop takes, rook takes, and here, I don't know, queen to g5 maybe. Queen to g5 threatens the e-file, but probably it's time for black to get developed here. Queen to d7. In this position, what are the most important components for black? Black's immediate next moves are going to involve, developing as quickly as possible. This queen side is underdeveloped. White has an active threat on b7. So playing moves like queen to c7, bishop to d7, rook to b8, that's going to end up being a good play for black. Queen c7, rook to b1, rook to b8. And now, black is still somewhat underdeveloped, but he has on the other side white with a worse pawn structure, and he has the ability to kind of recover things here. So bishop to c6, fine. Bishop takes, pawn takes. And basically here, I think black is comfortable. The king can basically clear out this pawn. White's pawn structure is going to be a liability, and the world champions are headed for another draw. Not many chances here at any point, just a draw. Anyways, really interesting stuff, I think. Also, this could be some instructive endgame play in terms of how to play, basically how to play down a pawn and draw as white. And we can take a look at this. Carlsen is not frightened down a pawn. And I guess I'm kind of amazed that they sort of play this out here, but I think their technicals are just fine. Rook to b7. Yeah, they're just sort of bouncing around at the end here. Black has no way of improving this position really without overextending his pawn, I think is the point. But yeah, I guess we can play through an endgame line. Let's just, take this line, for example, and watch how the computer draws itself. But yeah, I don't think there's much in the way here. I don't really think Black can force this too well. Anyways, interesting. Worth knowing, just basically having three pawns all within the king's range. This is a drawing position. Because these pawns are so easily defended by the king. I'm sure that they'll have a maneuver to basically trade into a non-winning rook and pawn endgame. But it's kind of interesting, because trading off into a rook and pawn endgame like this is something that, a lot of class players would be comfortable. A lot of class players would be comfortable doing. But the actual fact of it is that white has good drawing resources here. Yeah. So, anyways, it's really interesting. This was a draw. White never really was worried about the draw. In fact, white was willing to trade into a relatively, uncomplicated position from about this point. I'm kind of surprised. Basically this is highly technical rook and pawn endgames. I don't know. I think we should have more of these on the stream, to be honest. High level stuff. But yeah, basically this is going to end up. Black was very comfortable trading into a draw here, knowing that it was probably a draw, as was white. White was not afraid of this conclusion, and realized that trading into this endgame, where he was going to lose the d6 pawn, was his best option. Anyways, really interesting stuff. Also interesting in this rook and pawn endgame, how little white cared about losing this d6 pawn. I think a class player might be inclined to just, would be inclined to hold this rook on b6 for a long time, and then potentially get himself into trouble with king and pawn advances. But Carlsen plays this by just holding on to the, basically the point of advancement for all of these pawns. None of these pawns can break this plane of the rook there, and then ultimately, white just gives away that d6 pawn for free. Anyways, I think this points to another kind of interesting rook and pawn endgame principle. If you can't hold the pawn, don't try to expend resources holding the pawn, is the main point. Like, this pawn is lost. There's no way that this king's going to get involved, and there's no real, there's no real chance for this pawn to advance, being blockaded by the king, and with the rook easy to defend it. So white just doesn't care about this pawn, is the most interesting thing. White just doesn't, basically just doesn't let this, doesn't get worried about this. He immediately drops the defense on it, treats it as something completely expendable, and moves it to d7, without any chance of it going anywhere. So, anyways, I thought this was just interesting. I thought it was interesting how, here basically, white trades that pawn on d6 onto d7 just to basically secure this plane on the third rank. Anyways, really interesting. It's cool to watch GM level plays, players illustrate particular points. But I think that one's really interesting. If you're gonna lose a pawn in the endgame, you can just sort of give it up here, basically. If their tactical sight in rook and pawn endgames is strong enough that they see the pawn being lost, they don't expend any resources on it. Anyways, really interesting. Cool. Now we have a chance to take a look at the games that were sent in. So we have three. Alexandre's, yours was the one that was added just basically because someone canceled. Alexandre has one for 9:35 at 9:35. Yeah, so Alexandre has one. He has the last one of the stream, and let's take a look. The first one is from Elusive1234. Okay, let's look at his game. Um, so bird opening. This is interesting. I think Elusive was asking me about the bird opening on the Discord. The Discord is the bird opening is a really interesting situation. The bird opening is basically like the Dutch. I don't know how familiar people are with the Dutch, but the Dutch goes d4 f5. What ends up being common themes in the Dutch, usually a very closed position and lets white plays an aggressive gambit. Basically ideas like G6, which is called the Leningrad Dutch, E6, but basically a large pawn structure in an extremely closed position. That's the most common characteristic of the Dutch. There's a lot of maneuvering. There's a lot of moves where the knights will bounce around in a closed position between G8, F6, D7, E8. Just basically playing around here, trying to maneuver for specific pawn breaks. That's what tends to happen. But yeah, F4, D5, Knight F3, Knight to F6. I think here, I don't know. White's got a few options. Knight to F3. By the way, this is very common play. Black just basically plays, being willing to transpose this into a queen's pawn game with an F4 having been played. But basically, that early D4 F5. That's important because F4 is frequently a playable opening in queen's pawn openings, and Black is basically trying to shift the game into that position. So G3, so this would be the equivalent of Leningrad in the Dutch. Knight to C6, bishop to G2, and so they call this bird opening Dutch variation. I wouldn't have known that, but I guess it turns into the Dutch variation after D5. Okay. G6, castles, bishop G7, D4. D4 and F4, this is similar to a Dutch line where D5 and F5 have been played. A lot of interesting things here. So it's a close position, not much ability to attack the knights with the pawns, and potentially both knights could get outposted. Knight to E4 could definitely happen for black, and knight to E5 can definitely happen for white. So here, basically, E3, defending D4 and F4, sure. Knight to D2, knight to D7, B3. And here, basically, I think that situation's about equal, but black makes an error here. By the way, this is completely fine. I don't know if this is still in book, but this setup for white, this solid setup with F4, E3, D4, this is good for white all around. So I think I would recommend B2, potentially break with C4. But that I think is the way to play this. I think thematically, what you would probably want to do is that. I don't know. I'm thinking about middle game strategies here. B3, C4 secures a very strong position for white in the center. You're a little bit worried as white that the position's going to become too closed. But I think knight to E5 could be helpful, and bishop to B2 could be helpful. So overall, I like white's position. This B3, okay, and then C4, and then rook C1, or basically the idea that I have in mind for white, and I'm kind of wondering if this is correct or not, but I think it would be, is one where basically white challenges in the center and ends up with the ability to expand on the queen side and the queen side of the center. So like B3, bishop B2. Rook to C1, C4, I'm wondering is a plan for white. This also might be helpful because you're countering this bishop on G7 with, with your bishop on B2. Maybe. I'm also wondering if there are kingside, any kingside attack at this point is going to, or any movement of the H pawn to do a kingside attack is going to be kind of double-edged at this point. But let's kind of look through. Let's look at the eval of how the game goes, because this one's not super obvious to me where play should be. White can expand on the queen side, and that'll probably be helpful. Rook to C1 and C4. That's going to give white a big space advantage on the queen side. Both sides, if they want to avoid draws, need to start exchanging pawns, though, because you may end up in a situation that's closed enough that it ends up in an early draw. All right, F6, bishop to B2, E5. White is up here. Basically black has gone with this push of E5, trying to open up the position. I think potentially this is a little bit premature. D5, there could be threats on D5 coming in. After FX, Knight takes, pawn takes, maybe f5 or d5 becomes vulnerable. I'm also thinking c4 could be cool. And the engine is suggesting a tactically complicated thing that I wouldn't think of I couldn't think of this quickly, which is e4. E4, that's really interesting. So e4 and then e takes d4 and then d4, I think, right? No, just exchanging it. Interesting situation. Anyways, this really opens up the game, gives both players better winning chances, and then in this case, White would end up with a big spatial advantage on the queen side, as well as having better development since both of his bishops are fianchettoed. This bishop is stuck on d7. Basically, if we look at this position, actually, if you can play e4, e4, and then the response is pawn takes d5, knight takes d5, and basically every piece for white is better than every piece for black. That's where the eval difference is here. I think this is sort of worth looking at. This is a good outpost for this knight. It may get pushed away with f5, but then you can play probably knight to g5. So this outpost for white is strong. This knight is better than that knight. This knight is better than that knight, and the two bishops are better than each other too. So actually, really interesting situation. That's why e5 is good because on the simplification, the knight takes, and then every piece is better for white. So pretty interesting. F takes e5, f takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight takes, and then here the continuation moves. Basically, rook to f8 is getting proposed as the #1 move. c4 also is okay. Probably rook takes f8 though. Rook takes f8 seems to solve some problems for white. And it moves black pieces to the f8 square, which is sort of undesirable. Queen takes f8, not that great. Bishop takes f8, not playable. King takes f8, not great. So overall, queen takes f8 is the response here, and then white can kind of secure a good positional advantage. Engine is suggesting bishop takes d5, so that's a win of a pawn. King takes f8. So I guess here. You have some tactics on the d5 pawn. We were thinking about how there could be tactics on the d5 pawn with e5. So I was thinking e5 was probably a little too risky. This is a line in where we actually see that happen on rook takes f8. Because then after rook takes f8, I have to think king takes f8 is better. And then the issue with that is knight to c4, which is a pretty cool looking tactic actually. Knight to c4 again exploits the vulnerability of d5. This knight moves to c4, threatens this e5 knight. Pawn can't take, and basically this pawn takes c4 can be moved, and queen can take on d8. So, anyways, interesting. Queen to e2, rook takes, bishop to g4, and white is solid here. So ideas for white, queen to b5 potentially could be good. Probably the best move. This is the only move that really keeps white's position moving forward. So there's a big difference. This hangs a piece. So this is really an error for white. Knight takes f8, bishop takes knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, queen takes, and the bishop on b2 hangs. So all right, so the game is concluded with this tactic. So this tactic is definitely going to be a point of improvement. After queen to g5, everything was fine. On queen to e1, I'm sort of curious about. Queen to e1 doesn't allow the same issue, but definitely what was played, knight to f3, leads to the hanging of a piece here. So, anyways, that's a big difference. And on knight takes f3, basically white is much worse. After he's about to lose the b2 pawn. So let's think of where the actual improvements for white were here. I think that tactical situation ended the game. So that's one of them. But is there any improvements for white in this opening? The Dutch, or basically the bird's opening is going to get a pretty ungenerous treatment by the engine. It's not something that expands in the center as quickly. So it leads quickly to equality. Here, I don't know. I mean, what are white's plans? I sort of like bishop to b2. I like c4. I like rook to c1. A good push could happen later. If you play c3 now, you might be able to try e4 later. if you can get the e4 pawn played, that's one of the main thematic concepts of the Dutch. Is basically, the issue with the Dutch is that it creates potential weaknesses on e5 for black. So a thematic push of e5, and basically eliminating a backward pawn on e3. I draw, like, I'm thinking of Dutch theory when I think of this, but basically, eliminating this backward pawn with e4 is really going to be a good play for white whenever that becomes available. It's bishop to b2, e5, pawn takes. All of this sort of trades off. Fine. Yeah, thank you very much for staying up, Smiggy. Thanks for joining the stream. Get some sleep. So rook takes, bishop to g4, and then ideas like queen to g5 can be good. But yeah, this tactical mishap sort of ended it. I don't have many problems with white's play, to be honest. I think that this is a pretty good way of playing the bird's opening. You can end up in a situation where you play e4 and challenge in the center. That could be helpful. So yeah, so maybe e4 here. What happens with e4 here? Here, bishop to g4. So it's too late to play e4 here now. E4 is played on this move. Interesting. Okay, so the engine's offering that as improvement. All right, so I guess there's two real improvements in this game. The first is e4 was playable for white. This is a tactically complicated position. You would have to really check these tactics and spend time calculating. But the thematic e4, which trades off this backwards e pawn, which is weak, and it's equivalent to the e6 pawn in the Dutch. Trading this off for black's strong d5 pawn is a big improvement for white. So this is why e4 is recommended on this move. Again, this is something that you have to calculate pretty precisely, but thematically it's correct. I mean, if you can trade a backwards pawn for one of your opponent's key central pawns, it's always a win for you. So playing this up, basically playing this e4 against this d5, that is a good trade for white and something that white should do. Anyways, so that's the first improvement. And then the second improvement is this is just a tactical mishap. Better for white was queen to b5 by a lot, and queen to e1 and queen to f1 by a little. So anyways, interesting situation. Knight to f3, bishop takes, queen takes, and black wins a piece. But I think your play of the bird was right. The only error that falls into thematic concepts, conceptual improvements in this opening. I thought all of this was fine. Bishop to b2, knight to f3, knight to d2. Everything was fine until e4. Basically e5. You have the opportunity to play e4 in the Dutch, or in basically the bird or the Dutch. You might as well do it because it clears out one of your big liabilities, which is this backward pawn, which is normally facing off against d5 and f5. So yeah, I guess that's my main positional improvement here. Be ready to play e4 and improve, and you will improve your positions in the Dutch and the Dutch and the bird. So yeah. That's the thematic concept that I think is relevant about the bird's opening. Pretty much just something that I'm taking from the Dutch opening, but yeah, if you can play e4, this fixes your worst pawn or one of your worst pawns on the board and trades it for one of your opponent's best pawns on the board. So being a bird player, you should be very early to play moves like e4 if they're tactically playable. In this particular case, it was. So like. E takes d5, knight takes d5, and pawn takes, knight takes. Everything's fine on d4, completely playable for white. Best move for black, pawn takes f4, also fine for you. You play g takes f4, and you may or may not trade off on e4. But anyways, good situation, good play, and this ends up playing out well for white. So anyways, really interesting. F takes, and white is solid. With this line, you end up paying a piece, and the game concludes. So that's the main concept. There's a tactical mishap, and then there's a conceptual mishap. Be earlier to play e4. It's such a great move that it's worth really calculating the tactics around it. That was the error that I think white made in this game. Cool. On to the next one. We've got two more. This is another one. This is SWWI's game. Okay. Cool. E4, E5, knight to C3. So we're basically playing the Vienna game. D6 is not the most common for black here. Much more common are knight to F6 or knight to C6. Bishop to C5 is also playable. D6 is pretty far down the list. Let's look at the eval. I don't think the eval dislikes it or particularly dislikes it. And I guess it sort of sidesteps, it does sort of sidestep F4, which isn't a bad thing, but F4 is a common theme, this Vienna Gambit, where basically, you are supposed to counter with D5. It's pretty clear that D5 is the correct move for, basically D5 is a common move for black here. So this, this tends to be a line that you can avoid if you play D6. D6, okay. And white plays bishop to C4. Sure, another fine Vienna move. Knight to F6, D3, bishop to E7. All this is pretty normal. All right, and then white makes this challenge for the center with F4. This is very common in the Vienna game. Vienna Gambit, delayed Vienna Gambit. Here, it's not really even a gambit. It's basically you have the opportunity to take back immediately with bishop takes F4. So black should probably not take it. Most common for black after F4. E takes F4 is well down the list. Most common is knight to C6, developing the knight and providing more defense for the white doesn't take E5 either. Let's see how big the eval shift is for white. I bet this comes close to equality. After E takes, and black's single pawn in the center holds up well. So that's not the right play for white. Knight to F3, knight to A5, basically threatening to trade off this knight for white's good squared bishop. Makes sense. Better for white here than B3 is to win this pawn. So this is a big opportunity for white actually. Another thing, if you're playing F4 in the Vienna game, this is a situation that's going to come up for you. So if the knight goes to A5, you can counter it with pawn takes E5. This pawn gets lost. So D takes and then knight takes, and basically white has won a pawn for nothing. So overall, that's actually definitely a resource that you should be paying attention to as a Vienna Gambit F4 player. So knight to E5 that wins a pawn. Cool. So bishop to B3, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop takes. Now white is fine. But you could have been a pawn up here is the main point. So in terms of looking at the this position, takes each straightforward winning the pawn is better off than is worth more. Keep pawn structure better with pawn takes. This is a fine price to pay. You're getting an extra piece here. And by the way, knight takes C4, pawn takes F6, and you're double attacking. So that's the winning tactic on that. But yeah, be ready to take. You've played F4. If black hangs E5, then be ready to take it. Is the main point. Bishop takes, castles, H6, queen to E1. White's better here. Pawn point 6/6, queen G3. Sure, white is better. Queen takes is better than rook takes. Rook takes is a little bit awkwardly placed here, but mainly it causes this issue of knight to H5. If you allow knight to H5, then you lose your bishop for that knight, and that's not particularly good for white. So queen to F3, defending the H5 square and defending knight to H5 from being played. This is better for white. Rook to F3. Now white is. So the opportunity for us to play for an advantage here was to hold on to this bishop and basically, be ready to attack on the king side if possible. White has better center control and good pieces, so holding on to this situation, this is pretty good. So yeah, queen takes F3, better. Yeah, white's better here. And yeah, I guess things away. Uh, no, no problem. Thank you very much for sending your game, Alexandre. And every game is instructive. I really appreciate you sending it in any case. And thanks for being here. We'll be on to your game in about 3 to 4 minutes. So yeah, where are the improvements for white? This all looked fine. At this point, basically, the draw has been kind of secured. But the real error, so after rook to e7, you have rook takes a4. Cool. So now white's up a lot. And h4 is an error because of king to h5, rook takes h4, and then g5, and then pawn takes. But overall, trading off into this structure, trading off into where these are equal, and all you have is an extra c pawn, that's going to be drawish. So I think your best chance for improvement here. Let's go through like this line. Again, keeping the pawns on the board is probably a good idea. Also, if you can force this this pawn to be undoubled, that will really help you. Don't worry about it. It's all just for fun, and I'm very happy that you sent a game in, so I appreciate it. After this, yeah, this sort of got very out of control for black. Um, yeah. So basically this yeah, no, good. I'm glad I can help, Alexandre. Yeah, please keep sending as many games as you like. Very happy to look at them. Anyways, so let's look at the improvements front to back for white. Basically, the first improvement for white. You're a Vienna player who's playing f4. If the e5 pawn hangs, you can, you should be jumping on taking that opportunity. This is a mistake for black. And you can play pawn takes e5, and then if knight takes e4, you play pawn takes pawn takes f6 with a double threat. Cool. Bishop takes, castles, h6, and basically here I think white is fine. I don't know. A second big improvement here for white. Queen takes f3 is better. It doesn't allow this knight to trade off for the bishop. Now you just have good pieces. Basically, this knight trading off for this bishop trades basically what is a very good bishop for a kind of average knight here. So rook takes f3 is not the correct play. Queen takes f3, preventing the fork of the queen and bishop here. That is much better for you. Queen to g4, queen takes. All of this sort of makes sense. And then another improvement for white. I think this probably could have been a little bit more accurate. B takes c6 seems to be more pressing. On b takes c6, queen takes c4, pawn takes c4, pawn takes c6, rook to d3. And then your new plan is to attack this d6 pawn as aggressively as possible. I think you win this. You get close to winning this d6 pawn if you don't actually win it. I think this bishop has to play to f4 to defend it. But yeah, ends up being pretty good for white. Queen takes f7, and white is... I think white's fine after all this. But yeah, so in terms of drawing this, there's a big error in sort of getting the king over to this, basically letting this king take this g3 pawn. When the king plays g4, you must play rook to g1. If you just hang this pawn, this plays out basically this king is going to have a lot of chances to advance this pawn, and your king is basically completely cut off at this point. There's no ability for your king to get back to the king side, so you really have to hold on to this pawn here. If this happens, you're basically in trouble as white. So anyways, I think that ended up being a pretty good way for white to, or this basically ended up being a pretty good way for black to win. So in the three, basically the three things that I would change here, e5 was hanging for a move. I don't think you can allow that as white. If black plays knight to a5 and you're comfortable with this opening, you really should be playing pawn takes e5. The second was there was an opportunity for this knight to fork this bishop and queen. Better was queen takes f6, and then you get to hold on to your bishop. Trading off your better minor piece for black's worst minor piece, overall that's not a good trade. So that would be another improvement. And then the final one is basically the decisive error was hanging this pawn in this endgame. Basically if the g3 pawn gets hung here. So after c4, white plays rook to g1, fine. But if you just let this, and this is probably, realistically, this is probably a draw. But if you don't defend the pawn and you just basically give it up for nothing, this is difficult to hold on to for white. Probably a loss. So yeah. Those are three decisive moves of this game. Thank you very much for sending the game, SWWI. I appreciate it. Please keep sending them. Always interesting to look at. But yeah, those are three interesting situations out of this Vienna game with an early d6. d6, by the way, not the most common response to the Vienna, but one that sort of responds relatively directly to this f4. All right, Alexandre, thank you very much for waiting. Sorry yours is last, but let's take a bit and look at this. This should be a really interesting game. So yeah, since you're here, please feel free to ask any questions or let me know if there's things that you had in mind or whatever. I'm really happy to look through this. Let's take a look. So e4, f6. Okay. So when white plays e4, there's a number of different responses that black can play. f6 is not generally on the list of ones that you can play. It usually transposes the best with e5, but actually basically e4 facing off against f6 is going to allow white to basically secure a solid center. And also, if white plays e5, then f6 is not usually playable. So let's look at this situation. E4, f6, d4, e5. So here white takes, black takes. This queen plays to h5, and he forks the knight and the king and the pawn. There, g6, queen takes e5, king blocks, queen takes h8. So overall, Alexandre, I think this is this is basically a situation where white kind of is able to exploit f6. The weakest pawn on the board and the weakest square on the board for black is f7. White can put basically a lot of attacking pressure onto f7. So f6, which basically opens up this line, this h5 line into the king on e8, that is not a good idea. White should be playing something like e5. Yeah, no, for sure. Let's take a look at that. That's interesting, 93 precision. Let's look. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so knight to f3, e5, and now you have a big move here. Basically, you can comfortably play knight takes e. So e5, knight takes. This is good for white. I don't know how much this wins exactly, but I would recommend playing knight takes e5 here. On knight takes e5, pawn takes e5 is not playable. The queen goes to h5, then the king's best option is king to e7, but basically this is a bad situation for white. Bishop to c4, bishop to c5, knight to c3, knight to c6, and yeah, cool. Castles, knight to h6, and here we're basically getting into a situation that we were talking about before. So there's a few different positional things that are going on in this game. The first is, white has played f6 and e5. That makes this bishop on c4 have a powerful diagonal facing off against this g8 knight. That's important for white. White is going to end up in a good situation here where he's facing off against, where he's basically facing off on an open diagonal. Knight to c3, knight to c6, castles. White is good. White's up about a pawn. This open file could become a liability for black, and the f6 pawn isn't really helping to defend anything that this knight isn't. So f6 here is really the misplaced move for black. It's not immediately something that you can take advantage of, but having this open file makes your bishop stronger. It also keeps black from castling, so black's king safety is going to be worse than if he hadn't played f6. If you're looking for recommendations, just not playing f6 should be fine. d4 I think is playable here. You can play bishop f6, and on pawn takes f6. You can play knight to g5 and immediately capitalize on this open file. So that's big. That's important. D3 is is not as good. The reason why it's not as good is because D4 forces black to take action on this on this bishop. D3 does make a threat, and a good threat, which is bishop takes h6, but D4 here, and you're challenging this bishop on c5. Bishop d4 threatening c5. This ends up being good for white, and black basically needs to do something to respond to that, and you can respond with bishop takes h6. So d3, a6, bishop takes, pawn takes. Here you have a great situation as white. The way to, if you're in this situation, what you should do is play something like knight to h5, play something like queen to h5, and basically be ready to start trying to do checkmates on the king here. If your opponent gets his king side to be this messed up, you should do something like play queen to h5 and threaten the king there. Queen to d2. So queen to d2 is not as good. So queen to d2 does make a threat that black has to respond to, or that black can respond to, which is queen takes h6 and gets your queen onto h6, but it doesn't immediately get onto this file like this. You can play knight to h4 and then queen to h5, and basically threats along h5 to e8 are going to be good for white. So bishop to d5, and white is fine here. White is good. Black has really just created a bad problem for himself. This is f6. So the start of this all happened with f6. If he plays e5, then there's no open diagonal, and there's no basically wasted move here. Now, with all of these moves, so basically what happens is, now you're going to have a lot of opportunities to attack black on the king side. Queen to h5 is a big one, queen to h5 into e8. And the way you can do that the quickest is by playing d4, which gets this tempo on this bishop. And then when something takes d4, you play bishop takes h6. So that's so e takes d4, bishop takes h6, knight to g5, and then queen to h5. That ends up being good for white. So that is your improvement as white here. D3, bishop takes h6, pawn takes h6, and now you can play like knight to h4 and queen to h5. Overall, this should end up being good, but that's a better way to go about this than playing queen to d2. Knight to h4, queen to h5, and then this king on e8 has to go somewhere. So queen to d2 threatens h6, but nothing really comes of that. This queen wins h6. Black didn't really have to do that. Better opportunities for black were like queen to e7 and getting his king to e8. But all of this was a problem because black played f6 in the first place. Basically all of white's game is going to come from exploiting this open, this open file here. Bishop b7, queen takes, queen to h5, queen there. And now white is, I think, good. Basically, white can win a piece here with queen to d5. That looks like a good tactic to win that piece. Computer thinks you have better, but to me that seems fine. That secures a win. And here there's an improvement for you. So knight takes b4 here. You basically have the opportunity to take this knight on b4 and then move your queen back to d5. So rook to c1, lines up c4 and c5, and I'm guessing that that's probably the idea for attacking here, right? c4, c5, and then you have threats on the king. But I think that just taking the hanging pawn here is probably a better play for white. So knight takes b4, great, and white is way up. This eventually got knight takes b4, but only after black prompted. Black should have played bishop to a5 here. This would have defended the bishop. You'd still have good options. So say bishop to h5, or sorry, bishop to a5 here. You'd be able to play knight to h4 potentially, threatening knight to f4, or knight to e3 with queen to d5 attached. But yeah, this ends up playing out well for white. Cool. I don't think black ever really gets an advantage here. You have a great tactic with c5. C5 checks both the king and the queen, so after that, white is in fine shape with basically two pieces up. Yeah, I like white's position here. He's up a lot of material, and this is all good. Okay, so in terms of improvements for white, I think you played a good game. You had a lot of tactics. There's a few specific ones. So the first thing, Alexandre, is what I want to say is, I think the best way for you to, basically to improve your good tactical play. I think that's your most important thing. I think that's going to lead you to the best situations. So what I'm going to recommend, Alexandre, is check out the tactics trainers on chess.com. You sent me a chess.com game, but there's two really good tactics trainers on chess.com. There's Puzzle Rush, okay? This is where you do as many puzzles as you can in 3 minutes. And there's Puzzle Rush is one. And then there's Puzzle Battle, where basically you play someone else at puzzles. And I strongly recommend spending some time on this. I would say an hour or two a day for like a month, and I think you'll be seeing a lot more things. In both of these, you basically end up getting puzzles to where they're about at your level, and if you put the time in to really improve, I think that it could be really helpful for you. What you can end up doing is basically playing, end up playing opponents and getting your, getting your situation so that you're able to see more things. Where games are decided at your level is at tactical play. So, the idea that you can see a 2 or 3 move combination, and you saw a few in this game, which was great. So bishop takes h6, knight to h5. Overall here, I think this is, I think you did a pretty good job exploiting this. Black didn't need to open up that file, and things were pretty good for white once that happened. This was a great 2-move tactic, by the way. King moves to d6, and then you saw the tactic bishop takes, knight takes, queen to d5, threatening the king and the knight. That was a great tactic to win that knight. And then there's another tactic here, bishop to b4. You could play knight to d5 here, threatening the king and the bishop. If you do that, you win the bishop. So that's really important. So the main thing that I want to say, Alexandre, is the way to improve is, at your level, is really to do with tactics. It's not really something that I can teach super well. I can show it, but I can't really teach it super well. If you want to improve as quickly as you can, Alexandre, go to Puzzle Battle, go to Puzzle Rush, or go to, I think there's some free tactics trainers on Lee Chess, and there's good tactics trainers on Chess Tempo. But what you really need to do at your level, and this is the fastest way to improve, I think, by a pretty wide margin, is to just spend time doing lots and lots of puzzles. Basically do an hour or two a day for a month, and you'll see a lot more things that you didn't see previously. So I can do a tactical training or whatever, but that's what you need to do, Alexandre. Looking over the games is helpful, but the specific things that happen may not happen again for a long time. Every game is different, so this specific game may not come up again. But what is always happening in every game is tactical play and combinations. So what you want to do is you want to go on to Puzzle Battle. You want to basically, do one of these combinations, either Puzzle Rush, Puzzle Battle, whatever you can do for free, and do it for 1 to 2 hours a day for a while. Uh, chesstempo.com also has this for free, and Lee Chess has this for free. So yeah, so that's what I'm saying, Alexandre. Here, I'll show you. I'll do one, and then we'll close the stream. So basically, what Puzzle Battle does is it pairs you against somebody else. So this is what it looks like. It's you versus your opponent. So your opponent is gonna like start a is gonna like join here, right? And then it's gonna be the person who can do the most puzzles in 3 minutes wins. So you can play a lot of these games. You can do a lot of stuff. And here's this person. This person's really good. This person's probably gonna beat me, but we can take a look. And yeah, this is the idea. So basically, you just play as many puzzles as you can, and the first person to get three, and basically, the person who gets the most points without getting 3 strikes wins. If you get 3 strikes, you can still win, but your counter runs out. So here you're basically just sort of playing, you're playing an opponent. So this person's really good. This person's probably gonna win. But yeah. This training tool basically is super helpful in helping you improve. So I want to just kind of go through and show kind of what this looks like. I'm gonna try to beat this person too. I probably won't. This person's like a 2600, so that's pretty high for this. But yeah, we'll take a look and this game, which you can definitely do at least a couple times a day, I think will really help you to improve. So this wins that, and then that there. Okay. But yeah, so do this. It's fun. It's a competition. Do this for like 2 hours a day if you can, and you'll be able to recognize a lot more patterns a lot more quickly. That's sort of what I'm getting at here. Plus, it's always a good opportunity. I don't get to play as much of this as I used to, so overall, this is fun. Anyways, okay. Some complicated tactics here. But this is where you should be spending your time. So I realize that, I know that I'm giving you kind of a complicated thing, which is like, I'm not sure how much I can really help. This puzzle is difficult. Oh, it's just queen, I guess. Okay. But basically, the idea is that, the idea is that you spend a lot of time on this, and if you spend enough time on this, it'll really help your vision improve. So that's where I'm talking about. That's good. Yeah, this person's really strong. I'm probably gonna lose. Anyways, yeah, those can be really strong. Even if you lose, you still do excellent training. That's what I think's so good about it. But in terms of basically yeah, but here's the thing, Alexandra, you can do that too. You can basically just keep doing it over and over again until you get way faster. Is my point. It's not really it's not an impossible thing to do. You can get better and better at recognizing the patterns. But it starts you off at an easy level every time. So I think you can just do that and just keep doing it over and over again, and your score will gradually go up. That's what I'm saying, Alexandre. Like, it's not anything that's not rocket science. You can just do it, and basically eventually you'll improve. But I think that's where you want to be spending your time. I like Puzzle Battle, and I think there's one called Puzzle Racer on Lee Chess. If you spend your time doing those. Yeah, puzzle training on Lee Chess. I think if you do like 1 to 2 hours a day of that for a month, you'll be a lot better. It's really going to help your pattern recognition, and that's really where you'll see the best returns on your time. I thought you had a great couple really cool tactics in this game, but the important thing is that you really need to see moves like, here you have the great tactic knight to d5, but in order to really improve, you need to be able to see that that's a fork of this king and this bishop. If you do enough tactics, you're gonna be able to see that more easily. I promise you. It's the truth. It's just where to where you can spend time on that will give you the best return on time. So that's where I would say. Looking over your games is always helpful. But honestly, Yeah, no, I mean, but it's okay. The main thing is to just really get good at tactical play, and you'll see that type of thing every time, Alexandre. I think that's where you need to spend time in terms of lessons. I think that it's really great, and it'll have you improve in a well-rounded way to like get free lessons and get like a good understanding of kind of the concepts there. But yeah, where it will help you to spend the most time right now, like how your game will improve the most quickly right now, is with that tactics training, either on Lee Chess if you have that, or on chess.com if you have that. Whatever works, just make sure that you put the time in on it, and your game will definitely improve. So that's what I'm saying, Alexandre. That's basically what I'm proposing, and I think if you do that, that will be your quickest route to improvement. So that's my suggestion. Feel free. We have another game I think for you last night, or for tomorrow night. I mean, but yeah, definitely keep sending in games. I'm happy to look them over, but I'm not gonna pretend like taking lessons from me or from anyone else is gonna be your quickest way to improve. Your quickest way to improve is by doing the tactics trainer and doing it a lot. A teacher might be. I'm telling you, like, it's just a teacher's helpful. It's good to learn, but that is your quickest route to improvement. So I hope that's helpful, Alexandre. Feel free, please send in as many games. It's very nice of you to join the stream and to follow. But what I'm saying is basically, spend your time on tactics. That will provide the best return for you. Yeah, no, thank you very much for being here, Alexandre. I really appreciate you hanging out and watching the full stream. But 1 to 2 hours a day of that tactics training, and your game's going to improve as quickly as it can improve. So that's my suggestion on that. I think I'm going to wrap up for the evening. The next stream is at 8 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning. I really look forward to seeing everyone there, and yeah, I'm going to wrap up for tonight. Thanks all very much for being here. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you guys spending the time and watching this. Yeah, have a good night, everyone. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Bye.